Welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started as people are trickling in. Welcome to the Redefining Risk in the Ownership Economy, Part 1, Envisioning Sustained Ownership. I'm Sandhya Nakasi, co-CEO at Common Future, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So as we get started, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name, pronouns, organization, where you're tuning in from, and what you're hoping to gain from today's conversation. The idea of an ownership economy has been gaining momentum in recent years. The premise is really compelling. When more people own assets, whether it's businesses, homes, land, or enterprises, they have greater power and our economy becomes more inclusive and equitable. Yet, at Common Future and across our networks, we have been hearing several critical concerns. Many of the conversations that are around ownership are treating ownership as the solution to wealth inequality, while failing to grapple with the reality that ownership gains in Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color have historically been stripped away through violence, through redlining, through discriminatory policy, and weakened protections that continue today. So, what's at risk? We're living in a moment where infrastructure that sustains ownership, such as funding for community financial institutions, support for Black and Indigenous businesses, and cultural institutions who shape inclusive narratives, are being actively dismantled and silenced. Without protections, the ownership gains that we are working to expand will be short lived. The question we're seeking to answer today is, what are we risking if we treat ownership opportunities as the solution without addressing how they've been undermined and eroded in the past? That's what we'll be unpacking today and in this two-part series, which will continue in December. So we will together explore what it means to redefine risk in the ownership economy, not only building new pathways to ownership, but also bolstering the protections, the policies, and the community power needed to make ownership sustainable in the face of challenges. Today, our focus will be on creating a vision for sustained ownership. We'll explore a few questions, some of which include, what does community-controlled ownership look like when protection is built into the foundation from the outset? How do we build ownership models that can withstand backlash that has historically occurred when Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color accumulate wealth and power? What are the legal structures, policy frameworks, and protective measures that are needed to sustain community-controlled ownership over the long term? And then finally, what are some local examples that demonstrate the possibilities when ownership, community building, and protective infrastructure work in concert? For today's conversation, we have two leaders that are a part of Common Future's wider network, and I'll take a moment to briefly introduce them before we introduce our Common Future team and head into the panel discussion. First, we have Dr. Leslie Ford, who's an Associate Director and Practice Area Lead for the Center for Equity and Community Impact at the Urban Institute. In this role, she leads and contributes to research and policy advising that explores the sources of and solutions to racial, gender, and class-based inequities. Her work has covered vital topics such as diversifying the healthcare workforce, expanding the Black maternal health workforce, improving access to leadership development programs for leaders of color, and reparations for Black Americans. Most recently, Dr. Ford launched the Black Family Thriving Initiative, a research program designed to examine the role of wealth and wealth building for Black middle-class Americans. I'm also excited to welcome Bree Jones, who is the founder and CEO of Parity Homes based in West Baltimore. Bree is reimagining what equitable development can look like. Parity creates upfront demand for affordable homeownership opportunities by opening up pathways for existing residents and social collectives to purchase formerly abandoned homes as a means of community building and wealth building. Parity leverages storytelling and social networks to help majority Black homebuyers become financially prepared and deeply invested in the neighborhood's future. We also have two panelists coming from the Common Future team. The first is Marissa Guananja, our VP of Strategy and Partnerships. Marissa brings 15 years of programmatic experience from piloting and launching new community economic development initiatives in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to funding worker power efforts at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, to leading Roosevelt Institute's research, partnership, and government relations strategy as its chief programs officer. At Common Future, Marissa drives the strategy and impact of our partnerships to lift up Black and Indigenous-led and community-centered models for an economy that builds power, choice, and ownership. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Jaguna, our co-CEO at Common Future. Jennifer is an attorney, executive leader, strategist, and writer passionate about creating the conditions for all people to thrive. Whether it be within institutions or the broader economy, Jennifer focuses on improving conditions for and supporting the economic solutions built to empower Black, Indigenous, and other communities that face exclusion and extraction from our current economic systems. Prior to her promotion to co-CEO, Jennifer served as Common Future's Chief Operating Officer, where she implemented many initiatives, including the 4-day work week, equitable compensation, caregiver stipends, and others to create a more equitable workplace. Jennifer is also an Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity and serves on the board of Race Forward. So we have quite a set of panelists here to talk about this today. Very excited. As a last moment, a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording this webinar. It will be available in the next few weeks, and we will be hosting a next installment of this conversation in December. So please look out for an invitation in the coming weeks. Lastly, we'll be reserving a few minutes at the end of today's panel for Q&A from the audience. So as questions come up for you, please go ahead and place them in the chat or the Q&A. Now let's get started. To start us off, I want to really ground us in the idea that ownership is often presented as a straightforward solution to resolving wealth inequality. But we know that history has shown us that ownership gains for Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color have been systematically undermined. Jennifer, you've been following this conversation closely and have discussed the limitations of ownership. I'd be curious if you could share with us just the current state of those ownership economy conversations as you see it, and what are some of the blind spots and gaps in how it's being discussed today?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Sandhya, and hello to everyone joining. I am really excited to join this panel and to be among this fabulous group of folks for this discussion. And if you're not already familiar, the work that we do at Common Future is creating an equitable economy by investing in the solutions and imagination of leaders in organizations addressing racial and economic injustice. So we have been very fortunate to partner with leaders and community-rooted organizations across the country who do this work every day and who are advancing different models that are addressing the vast inequities that exist in our economy and society. So this includes business ownership, real estate, home ownership, employee ownership, and different methods, just given how these are recognized pathways for building wealth. At the same time, we've noticed that broad conversations across the economic ecosystem are highlighting ownership solutions as they should, but they're not really connecting the dots between past and present ways in which ownership is undermined. And so Sandhya, you mentioned in your intro, and I know many of us are familiar with some of those historic methods of undermining ownership and building wealth, including redlining, things like eminent domain, discrimination in loan approval, to name a few. And so it continues to be important to link these past practices to present inequity, given the ways in which they still manifest. But in addition to that, there is also a lot that is happening presently that I don't think has been adequately linked to these solutions as we talk about them. So that includes really a full erosion of the protections and the infrastructure that even make ownership and wealth building remotely viable and sustainable. So we've, in the past year especially, seen a lot of threats to our civil rights infrastructure, and some of those ways of enforcing anti-discrimination laws. It's had a chilling effect on how we talk about some of the root causes of the challenges here. And it's made it much more difficult to address disparities and disparate impacts among Black, Indigenous, and other communities. We've also seen the gutting of institutions such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that protected consumer assets from predatory and discriminatory practices, which include access to loans for homes and businesses. We've seen the gutting of the CDFI fund, which supports delivery of financial services in unbanked and underbanked communities. And we've even seen things like the building of AI data centers in Black and other communities where there have been ownership gains, but those gains will certainly be threatened when we think about the toxins that are emitted and the siphoning off of water and electric resources in these communities and not really spreading those burdens equally. So these are just a few examples of things happening today that threaten ownership, but are not being paired in the conversations on the solutions outside of those conversations in directly impacted communities. So I would say it's just not enough to offer ownership solutions without continuing to interrogate who gets to own, the barriers that prevent ownership and that make sustaining ownership difficult, if not impossible, and the laws, policies, practices, and narratives that can make or break ownership gains altogether. And ultimately, the bigger picture is that this isn't just about ownership for ownership's sake. It's about who gets to belong and have choice and freedom in our society through the pathway of ownership.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I think about what you're sharing is like a lot of the ownership conversation is very market based without recognizing how markets are actually upheld and sustained, and the interventions that are needed across sectors to make that possible. I want to turn to you, Leslie, because you've done an extensive amount of research and brought together a wide range of voices to explore what it means for Black families to thrive. And as we consider the history of ownership, I'm curious, what are the patterns and barriers you are observing in the way that this conversation is trending today? Kind of bringing in what Jennifer had also shared just now.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. And I could listen to Jennifer talk all day, but happy to answer this question. So I think, I cannot begin to respond to this question without first noting that ownership is both a historical concept and one that is, filled and charged with like racial and ethnic and historical tension. And I think we need to like sort of acknowledge that, historically in this country, Indigenous communities have held a worldview that, um, certain assets are communal and they're not necessarily to be privately held. And we know that that belief system comes in direct conflict with a sort of capitalistic private ownership model that the US has, sort of strongly held on to, and that one that we are all operating in. And also similarly for, Africans and African Americans in this country, ownership as a concept has evolved from the origins of enslavement through systems of exploitation and the extraction of labor and we've had to overcome so many structural and systematic barriers to even enter a conversation about land ownership or property ownership or business ownership. And so bringing those sort of historical realities into today, I do see some, significant progress and I do see significant efforts across industries, whether it's philanthropic, public, private, corporate, to advance progress on upward economic mobility for certain groups, particularly groups that have faced historical barriers. So for like, I just kind of want to focus in on like Black small business ownership, just as an example and as a case. So between 2017 and 2022, we've seen a more than 50% increase in the number of Black small owned businesses, or yes, Black owned small businesses in the US. And these firms helped to add, upwards of $200 billion of revenue to the economy. They paid $61 billion in salaries. Like all of this is really, really great. And as a result, I think of this progress and this momentum and this energy, I think a lot of folks have placed a lot of emphasis on the potential of Black small business owners and entrepreneurs to help sort of catalyze like the closing of a racial wealth gap, or just dramatically increasing community wealth and well-being in Black communities. And while I'm generally sort of excited about the progress, I'm a bit cautious about us not considering the broader context in which many of these Black-owned small businesses are operating. Um, we know that we cannot, small business or entrepreneurship our way out of economic disadvantage, out of poverty. We cannot close the racial wealth gap with small business ownership. We also know that Black small business owners continue to face many significant barriers, both to establishing or starting a business. So that includes like access to capital, the fact that the Black homeownership rate is still comparable to what it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed, in 1965. Black Americans have less household and home, like wealth to draw on from their homes to start their businesses. We also experience a lack of credit access, which can make it really difficult for Black entrepreneurs to enter and own a business and then also scale those businesses. I also think it's so important as we talk about the potential and promise of any pathway to wealth creation or wealth building for Black communities is to acknowledge for Black small business ownership rate in this country is only about maybe 3%. Black Americans are about 14% of the US population. And so I think as we think about potential solutions and patterns and trends, I think that we have to be honest about both the structural barriers that still exist and to think about the ways that we can't necessarily just target a small group of people, but we have to think about community wealth and well-being and how to spread that more evenly across communities.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I think this point around kind of um, hyperfixation on seeing something positive happening in a community, but not really kind of unpacking the systems that are actually that many of, in your example, Black-owned businesses face on a daily basis, and it's actually quite exceptional that some have been able to build wealth amidst these conditions. Marissa, turning over to you, in our economy, ownership is really often framed as the primary means through which we're achieving wealth, growth, efficiency. How should we be thinking differently about ownership as more than just an asset or an endpoint to building wealth? What are some of the narratives that you feel need to shift for ownership to become truly meaningful and effective for communities?
Thanks, Andrea. And again, just really happy to be in conversation with all of you. I actually want to tie back to something that Leslie was just talking about and a reflection that I had in her comments, which is like whether the goal is more ownership or a different kind of ownership. And so, the current framing around ownership is really around, as you said, wealth, growth, efficiency. I would add control to that. And we see that playing out, I think, on a couple of different levels, both at the individual level, where the achievement of the American dream is really still synonymous with owning your own home, being your own boss, owning your own business. And we also, I think, see it playing out in the larger political economy where, we have Elon Musk owning and controlling Twitter, Jeff Bezos owning and controlling the Washington Post, owning and controlling of like means of information and like how we dialogue in the political economy. I'm also actually going to point to entrepreneurship just as an example of like how this plays out. This year, Common Future launched the Legacy Labs, which is a project that partners with 10 businesses across 4 cities to help us reimagine entrepreneurship as a driver of community wealth. And while the focus of the cohort is on reimagining entrepreneurship, I think the conversation and observations of what needs to shift in the ownership space more broadly. I think we're learning a lot from those conversations, and about the narratives and mindsets that need to shift. Um, Ownership and the dominant narrative in practice, and frankly, and Leslie, you mentioned this as well, in the very founding of our country has been about possession and control and who owns the title, who owns the profits, my home, my business, my equity stake. It's about maximizing profits for the owner, which very quickly gets us to extraction. Um, and so in our relationships with traditional and cooperatively owned Black businesses through legacy labs, I mean, we're really seeing the values and mindsets that are rooted in the tradition of Black cooperativism that serve as a foundation for ensuring the different kind of ownership that we want to see. So ensuring that ownership is a meaningful tool for community wealth and well-being. And so in that, there are narratives and mindsets that are really important to like draw out as we start to shape a new idea around ownership. So about stewardship, about accountability, about interdependence, about resilience, safety and care. Um, and here, I think I want to zoom out for a second about there's, I think, a broader discussion about power more generally and where we shift from power as a means of control or coercion to power as the means to shift conditions for yourself and your community. And so again, I think we're talking about a different kind of ownership, a different kind of power that we want to see play out in our systems and institutions and infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you, Marissa. I think that that squarely kind of supports a transition into to Bree. And I think we've talked a lot about the pathway to community ownership just being the beginning, but also creating protections and what does it mean to actually build power for with community for community. Um, so I would just love to have you, Bree, jump in to share about your work in West Baltimore. How is that kind of in response to a lot of what like, we're talking about today, and really thinking about how you're seeing that build power, community power, as well as the kinds of protections you see are needed in this moment to sustain the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Well, I'll kind of just echo first by just saying it's such an honor to be on this panel of such distinguished and powerful and dynamic women. So thank you all for like considering me amongst your ranks. My name is Bree Jones. I'm the founder and CEO of Parity Homes. And for me, my the story actually starts in my own like personal journey with wealth building. I did not study real estate development. I actually started my career on Wall Street. And was this like young 20 something making more money than I really should have been, and just like on this like upward wealth building trajectory, and was actually in the process of looking to purchase a home when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And that was such a defining moment in my life's journey because Trayvon was murdered in his neighborhood where he lived, walking from his home to go buy a pack of Skittles. And he was presumed to be an enemy in his neighborhood. He was presumed to be a threat in his own community. And, probably for his mother, Miss Sabrina, she thought, I own this home. This is finally the legacy and the stability and the safety that I'm building for my family. But what that made me realize was that, unfortunately for Black Americans in this country, proximity to wealth does not equal proximity to freedom or proximity to safety. And so, as I was going through my own home buying journey, I realized that it would not benefit me to pursue an individualist journey. And I needed to be looking for and seeking out a community of people that reflected me, whether it was, all the ways that one can be reflected. And so what that made me realize was that while I had personally had access to, wealth and being able to purchase a home for myself, a lot of the people who I would have loved to be in community with did not have those same opportunities. And that is really where parity was born from, with the notion of, can we create intentional communities? Can we create pathways for people who reflect one another, for people in social collectives to kind of collectively purchase homes alongside one another, to start to create that safety, so to speak, in more ways than one. And so what I kind of realized was that if you look historically, and thank you for, to Leslie for kind of anchoring us in the history of capitalism versus the more communal stewardship that a lot of Indigenous and Afro-Caribbean, all the folks have kind of used as their form of like organizing. Um, if When people are deeply connected to land, when people are deeply connected to a place, they have the ability to grow roots. They have the ability, when they're building those relationships with the land, they build relationships with one another. And then that allows them to build power with one another because they have that history, that shared experience to work together to move things forward. But unfortunately, for Black Americans in this country, the last 400 years have been one of forced enslavement, displacement, uprooting, upheaval, um, raising, eminent domain, demolition, all the forms of destruction that you can think about. And so for Black Americans, we have been trying valiantly to grow roots in a place and grow our connection to the land so that we can grow connection with one another, so that we can build power. So Parady's theory of change, to use kind of like academic, language, is that if we can create communities, intentional communities where people have that deep connection to place, but amongst one another, and they are given or, taught how to self-organize. How do we collectively manage conflict? Because conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you are debating what to eat for dinner tonight, that's conflict. Like conflict happens all the time. It's just how we deal with it as a collective that defines us. And then do we know how to civically engage with our elected officials? If there's a pothole on the street that we all, share because our homes are on that street, how do we collectively engage or civically engage to get that pothole filled? How do we civically engage to make sure that the schools are teaching our children the way that we believe they should be taught? Um, Never did I, think when I started this company that we would also be figuring out how to survive possible like attacks because of like white nationalism, or survive militia, or survive like a National Guard deployment. But inevitably, for better or for worse, when you build community with people in close proximity to you that have both shared interests, but also shared values and the principles of collective organizing, what results is a resilience to withstand whatever shocks might come about, whether they be economic, political, social, whatever they may be. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it back, is that I love if you think about like the mangrove tree, mangrove's roots are actually like they grow like this. And the reason that that's so important is because it allows for uh, the trees to rely on each other for their strength, so that in times of extreme adverse weather conditions, they're not swept away by a storm because they have each other to lock roots with. And I think that at least for parity, building those intentional communities allow our homeowners, while they individually own their homes, it allows them to build that collective strength and withstanding. So
Thank you, Bree. I want to turn it to you, Leslie. Bree just shared about, ways to build community power that are also interlaced with ownership opportunities. And that being one pathway to supporting longevity in place, and to build kind of that long-term power. From your experience and from your research, what are some safeguards that you feel are needed, so that ownership isn't eroded by market pressures and political shifts? And Bree sharing community power is one of them, but I'd be curious to hear from you. What are some other pathways.
Sure, absolutely. And I love the point about building community power. My mind tends to lean more on like policy levers and policy solutions at the local, state, and federal level. Um, but I'm going to try to sort of tie all this together. So I want to start maybe with a point about land ownership, um, and why it is so important that we establish proactive policies, ones that not only enable wealth and wealth building, but also protect wealth and prevent wealth stripping, extraction, land loss, those sorts of things. So I think most people here probably know that over the last couple of hundred years, Black Americans in the United States have lost more than 80% of the land that we've owned. So that includes rural, agricultural, acquired land, homes, farms, all of it. Between um, 1907 and 2007 alone, that land loss has significantly widened the already deeply entrenched racial wealth gap in this country. And we know that land and land ownership and home and the concept of home place matters, significantly, to Black Americans. So I just kind of want to briefly touch on a concept and a process that has happened, and then I'll talk through a couple solutions that I think could be, really helpful. So I think a lot of folks here have heard of the concept of heirs property, or the idea that family-owned property or land has been passed down through multiple generations without a will. And it means that meaning that legal heirs have the right to use the land, but not a clear or marketable like title or deed to that land. And so this unresolved ownership sort of condition makes it very difficult to sell, finance, manage, make improvements to this property. And it can contribute to ownership being vulnerable for individuals, for families. It can be lost through forced sales or auctions. All of these things, you know, can present challenges. Um, so that's the land ownership side. On the business ownership side, I think we're all very familiar with the effective closure of the Minority Business Development Agency. And we know that this agency was established to help promote the growth, the development, the sustainability of minority businesses. It was designed to unlock the full potential of this country's economy, had all of this potential, all of this promise. And since March of this year, the agency is essentially no longer effectively operating. Most of its employees have been reassigned or terminated or have experienced a reduction in force. And the funding, I think this is maybe one of the most important parts, the funding that was going to local and state MBDA offices that was supporting entrepreneurs and small business owners at the local level has been completely cut. So this has made it more difficult for Black entrepreneurs to access capital, to secure financing, to secure contracting opportunities. It has cut them off from this vital resource of mentorship and networking opportunities. It makes it more challenging for their businesses to scale. So on one hand, we both have the challenges and the persistent challenges of the impact of policy on the business side, and then on the land and home and like property ownership side. And I say this all to say that we're in this very, very critical moment where we not only have to design policies, programs, and interventions that protect land, property, home ownership, business ownership, et cetera, but we also have to acknowledge the systems and structures that make it challenging or impossible for individuals and families to enter home and land ownership and to enter business ownership to begin with. So kind of going back to one of Jennifer's earlier points, I think it's important for us to consider the role that anti-discrimination policies and practices have at the local and state level today. And most importantly, the enforcement of those policies. I think that we know that there's been some removal or some pullback of those policies at the federal level, but that does not change the protections that exist at the city and state level to ensure that anti-discrimination policies, are enforced and are monitored, and that there are consequences. So this includes making every effort to ensure that um, we eliminate discrimination in lending practices, and we also expand and increase transparency in our credit and lending systems. Again, that has the impact both on the business side, but also on the home, personal, and also like land ownership side. So I know that we have a lot more to get through. So I just want to really quickly say like a couple of really key policies that I think for business and asset protection. So for small business owners, for folks who are acquiring or taking over businesses, we have to make sure that those folks have access to the proper legal advice and guidance as they're setting up systems and processes. We have to make sure that they have structures in place like trusts, as well as like estate planning tools. We have to make sure that businesses have adequate and appropriate personal and commercial insurance. And on the wealth protection side, for business owners, all business owners should be aware of practices like equity stripping, which are more likely to impact Black owners. So what that refers to is the idea that liens can be used to reduce equity, in an asset. So we have to make sure that Black and Indigenous business owners are protected and are aware of these practices and processes. And on the home ownership side, we want to make sure that families have deeds, home deeds, land deeds, deeds of all kinds, as this is the only legal proof of ownership. And there are also programs and policies that exist at the local level and programs that families and households can access to help ensure that they have access to resources to cover home maintenance and home repair costs, which are another part of how families end up potentially losing properties because the costs mount. And also programs that we can connect families and individuals to that provide legal assistance. So some of these, are individual, and then some of these are city, state, and sort of local policies or practices. And then again, just kind of returning really quickly to the idea of moving beyond like individual and family wealth. In terms of community wealth, I think, kind of going back to some of the models that have been touched on, I think it's incredibly important to identify opportunities for families and communities to buy into things like community land trusts and worker cooperatives. Um, One of the models that I'm sure this group is familiar with, and there's a lot of energy and momentum around, is employee ownership. And it's pretty well documented that employee ownership has sort of the highest rates or participation in places like Vermont or North Dakota and Maine. And so we kind of need to get beyond that geography, and we need to get into geographies where there are higher proportions of people of color who can benefit from these models, and to expand it beyond, where it's primarily concentrated right now in construction and in manufacturing. And so we want to make sure that employee ownership is a model that expands in industries where Black folks and Indigenous folks are most likely to be concentrated.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Those are some really actionable pieces that we can take with us after this conversation. I can't help but think about when you lifted up the enforcement of anti-discrimination policy and laws, I should say, how actually emerging narratives have turned that against us and against the work that we're trying to move forward. So I want to kind of bridge that over to you, Marissa, around kind of narratives and the importance of um, narratives as building power for these movements. So building on what Leslie and Bree shared, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more around um, why uh, or why this matters in terms of actually building narratives that have a deep understanding of power. To Bree's point, and what are the um, why is that important in terms of sustaining a vision for ownership that actually moves us away from kind of this individual piece to a more collective ownership that can be sustained for the long term?
Thanks, Andrea. And apologies for the co-working conference room distraction, if that was a distraction. But I'm back. Um, so I actually think this matters. I mean, we've talked a lot about, and it's very real, the dismantling of the protections that are around ownership, that are really important. Um, but I do like there's in the dismantling, there's going to be an opportunity for rebuilding. And so it's in the rebuilding that I think, again, like for what is really important. And so just to like really put it simply, I think the narratives, mindsets, beliefs, all this stuff that honestly, like a couple of years ago, I would have thought of as like really squishy. All of that, like that's not a technical term, but like all of that stuff like really matters for shaping institutions and policies and the priorities that govern them. Um, and so if we believe simply that ownership is about maximizing profits for the owner, then we're going to operationalize that profit-seeking belief to extract profits without regard for the impact on the inputs, labor and land. Um, but if we move from an ownership model of profitability to one of shared prosperity, which is, I think, what we've been discussing here, then what we measure as success would shift from, say, like net profit or ROI, cost per output, productivity per worker, to include metrics like, say, like percentage of profits reinvested locally, to worker well-being and retention. And so, our narratives, our beliefs, our ideas around like what ownership means, like translates to very like practical, like how we interpret and how that logic is going to flow through the development of institutions and the development of policies. Um, and so I think we do want to like have a nuanced critique of ownership, so that we don't keep reproducing the old logics in are the opportunities that are coming to rebuild.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I think this is kind of just like tying this together in a full circle loop around we need to understand the history and what has destabilized ownership in the first place. Understanding that history allows us to build solutions that actually um, address the weaknesses in past solutions, and doing so creates new narratives around what can be possible uh, as we build. And then we need power, community power, to really build all of this, to institute policies and practices that Leslie is talking about that secure gains, and understanding that kind of policy and doesn't necessarily connote that practices follow, but if we're able to kind of build into solutions and build power around these solutions, we can change mindsets as well. Um, I'm noticing we have 5 minutes left. I want to invite Bree and Jennifer into this next question, um, and then we will pop over to the Q&A if there are other questions that people have. So I want to talk about like the moment we're in now. Bree, you've built a solution that is, I guess, looking back, like I'm not sure that uh, you designed this for the moment that we're in today, but you have been designing something that can sustain, right? And I'd be curious for you, as you think about what's next and you think about the moment we're in, how do we keep advancing the work that you're doing? And Jennifer, how do we keep advancing and supporting the work that the Brees and the Leslies and the common futures of the world are doing, in a moment where we're facing a lot of destabilization? So, Bree, I'll invite you in, and then Jennifer, you can round us out.
Okay, you gave me the hard question to close out on. Um, I think what I'm sitting with is on the one hand, I feel that parity is lucky because we were able to kind of start and kind of grow like a foothold prior to all of this. So we are just kind of like in a place where we have amazing supporters who've like wrapped their arms around us and like who are blocking and tackling for us on a larger scale, while so that we can continue to do the work on the ground. But I think one thing that strikes me, so we are trying to do this development on a large scale. We own 50 properties. We are that we're developing, which encompasses several blocks of vacant properties. Baltimore has 15,000 vacant buildings, so we are. I mean, 50 is still just a drop in the bucket, but it's large on a per developer basis. So we're trying to scale. But one thing that strikes me is that there are interventions that can happen on a micro level. You don't have to get to 50 homes. You don't have to get to 15,000 homes. It can be a single home that, or a single entity, whatever, that looks like for you. But I'll just use homes because that's what I'm familiar with. There are, for example, single moms who are cohabitating together. They're coming together to purchase homes so that they can collectively raise their babies together. Like for me, that is a form of resistance. That is a form of stabilization. That is a form of joy. That's a form of community. There are a lot of, I think we're seeing a lot of families return to multi-generational housing where the adult child's on the third floor, grandma's on the first floor and uncle's on the second floor. Sharing those housing expenses, that's a form of resilience and stabilization and joy. So for me, I think another example of housing protection that I love is instead of trying to build new construction homes, which are really difficult because land is hard to come by and hypersaturated, cities like New York and DC and Seattle. Instead, what some developers are doing or some nonprofits are doing is they're purchasing previously existing what they might call like NOAA, which is naturally occurring affordable housing. And when that kind of more speculative capitalist owner goes to sell the property, they're purchasing that building and then converting it into perpetually affordable housing. I think for me, in 10 years, what's a healthy ecosystem is that there is a diversity of housing typology in any single neighborhood. There's market rate housing, there's community land trusts, there's a good mixture of ownership, there's a good mixture of rental, because I think that healthy neighborhoods are one where there's a diversity of socioeconomic realities. So I say that to say, like, I'm not a policy wonk. I'm like super like in the weeds at the ground level, but I think if there's anyone who's in my position, just you can take a stance on a micro scale. Don't think that you have to be big in order to make a difference. The last thing I'll say, when I was starting Parity, real estate is capital intensive. To do one home for us is $300,000 to do one. And I had zero. I had negative $2,000 in my bank account. Okay. I was broke out when I was starting Parity. And like, I was like, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to raise the money? It's impossible. And I often ask people, like, what do you think my minimum viable product was? What was my MVP to prove that the model was viable? And some people are like, oh, well, you have to at least get one house done, or you need to get half of the house done. Or for me, the minimum viable product was I went on Craigslist, sent an artist a picture of the block I wanted to buy and renovate. And I said, make this rendering, make this block look like it's lived in. Fill up, all the boarded up windows, put windows in it, put the roofs back on, make it look nice, and put people walking on the street and put some trees on it. And that was $100. And that was all it took for me to get the buy-in for people to say, oh, I want to live there. That looks amazing. Like, sign me up. And, the funders to say, I believe in this vision. We're gonna, invest in you. So I say that to say, like, I just want people to feel encouraged that while it feels like we are up against such a big challenge, which we are, there's just so many small ways that we can claim victory, and just to feel encouraged as you move forward.
Yeah, thank you. You also kind of touched on a question in the chat, but before I turn it over to that, I wanted to invite in Jennifer to share what you're thinking right now. How do we keep advancing in this moment?
Yeah, I think we heard a lot of just rich and amazing insights in this conversation. And I'll leave us with three things. I think the first is we have to continue to contend with the seriousness of the landscape we're in and being specific about why there's wealth inequality whenever we talk about ownership. We've heard from Marissa and others, narrative is really critical here to really help us unpack that understanding and bring people along. I think the second is we have to continue to take a long-term view and really see all the ways in which, ownership gains are made and then undone, and then really design for that. So, what does it mean we do differently in our designs and planning? What does implementation look like? Who's at the decision-making table? How can we think about and bring more of these collective, cooperative, community-owned principles into more of the designs? And, what should accountability and enforcement look like? And we have to recognize that there is no single tool that is going to be the be all end all solution. It's going to take a variety of different tools. So it's going to take the capital investments, it's going to take the community infrastructure, the collaborative efforts, government support, legal tools, and also just a recognition of the value that already exists in the communities that we're talking about and that we work with. And when we recognize that, we can really arrive in a place where we have and we yield multi-generational promise. And I think the third thing is, and I will always continue to beat this drum, is just the funding and the investments in organizations and models that accomplish this, especially in an environment where, it's easy to focus on the shorter term type of solutions. And that's really important, just given that so many people are facing perilous conditions today. But we also have to, just continue to have that long-term vision, and work toward that because those investments are ultimately a belief in futures and a future that we all deserve. So with that, just want to thank you again, Sandhya, for your moderation of this panel and for all the really wonderful information that others have shared in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. We have two questions that came through in the Q&A, and I think Bree answered a little bit, but I'm curious if others have thoughts. One question was around one question was around how can micro businesses take steps to create change for themselves and the world around them? And this person is talking about actions, short-term actions in the 1 day, one week, 60-day, quarterly timeline. So kind of in recognition, Jennifer, of like this work is long term, but what are the steps to build us there? And then the other question is around being in the middle of a, this person said, I was in the middle of a conversation about the importance of investing in redistributed ownership. And one person asked, but if everyone is an owner, won't that worsen environmental damage because even more people are going to try to maximize their returns? Um, there's definitely research around how the centralization of ownership leads to environmental degradation, but having this data that shared ownership can also contribute to, I'm assuming this meaning sustaining the environment. So I'll open those two questions to the panelists as you want to take them, and invite in whoever would like to share first.
I can hop in first on that second question and be pretty quick. It doesn't necessarily pertain to environmental degradation, although I do agree that that isn't a concern. But for parity, what we've built into our model is so our homeowners actually go through an 8-week curriculum that teaches them the ABCs of ownership, like how to go through a mortgage. It teaches them about the civic engagement that I talked about. So, how do we collectively organize as a group to demonstrate power? But it also teaches them about intersectionality and about how do we not just show up for ourselves, but how do we show up for others? And so call it what you want. I know socialism, I prefer mutualism because I strongly believe that in order for me to survive and thrive, I need everyone around me to survive and thrive because we all are codependent on one another. And so a lot of we teach that to our homeowners, and we actually have that written into we have deed restrictions. And the way that shows up is that we ask our home buyers, like, hey, we're gonna sell you a deeply subsidized home, you're going to be able to build a lot of wealth, all the stability, but we ask that you pay it forward. And so, for example, our homes are big, they're 3,000 square feet, you can have your house built out as a 2 unit. So if you have that other unit, yes, you can, rent to your family or cohabitate, but if you choose to rent it to a tenant, we ask that you don't Airbnb it. We know Airbnb is a way that people can maximize their personal profit, but we're asking you not to do that. We're asking you to pay it forward. You got a deeply affordable home, create a deeply affordable rental unit for someone else. And our home buyers agree to that because it's part of our shared ethos and our shared values. We also have basically what's called a shared equity model, which is based off of the Grounded Solutions Network model, which I encourage you guys to look into if you want to do this type of housing work. That says, like, hey, you can sell the home at any time. We have no restrictions on that. But if you sell the home, we ask that you sell it to someone at an affordable price point, like you were able to get your affordable price point. And you know what? If you say, look, I want to sell this home for $1 million, all right, we can't, tell you no, but you're going to share that upside with us because we subsidized the house to begin with, and then we're going to redeploy that all that money that you made in that personal profit scheme. We're going to take that and redeploy it to the next affordable homeowner and give it back to the community. So it's not just like a feel good, it actually has teeth in how we kind of enforce some of these like shared ownership and like ethos structures.
Yeah, thank you, Bree. I think kind of embedded in that answer, I'm hearing also this we have to redefine what it means to actually be owners, and what are the values that we hold around ownership, um, and buy into that collectively. It's not about maximizing our profit. It's about building a community and being in relationship with one another, and sustaining that for the long term. And that's a different orientation than historically has been seen. Um, I'm seeing one other question in the chat, which I'd love to just quickly, if anybody has any thoughts on, um, to just bring some discernment around community ownership and governance and what it can look like, and not just from a representation lens. And I see, Marissa, you're kind of typing away. So if you want to just jump in and answer, beyond representation, how do we bring nuance to something like that?
Thanks. I mean, I was just typing in, Grace, and also happy to chat more about this because this is an active conversation in our Legacy Labs conversations. That language does matter a lot, and so there is I, I mean, we've been talking about a bit of a continuum of like community ownership versus accountable to community versus informed by community. And so I think adding a lot more definition to these and like how we move away from the traditional view of ownership along that continuum to community ownership where there is actual like equity stakes and like governance in place. I do think that that is important. I appreciate you calling that out. And again, like really happy to talk a bit more about this with you.
All right, we are at time. So I just wanted to thank all of our panelists here, for sharing their insights with us. It has been really humbling for me to just hear from all of you the different perspectives you bring to this space of ownership, and the different interventions that are needed to actually secure ownership for the long term, and redefine what does ownership actually look like, in that way. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts. Thank you to everybody who joined us. The recording will be available in a few weeks, and we hope you join to the next part 2 conversation, which is going to be in December. Thank you.